Good afternoon. My name is Irwin Chemerinsky, and I have the wonderful pleasure of being the Dean of the Law School. And I have the terrific opportunity now to introduce you to two wonderful individuals. We're gathered here for the 4th annual Mark Robinson Lecture to be delivered by Harvard professor David Wilkins. Mark Robinson is one of the pillars that this law school is founded on. Mark is one of a very small group of individuals who fought for 20 years to create a law school at the University of California, Irvine. It's a true statement that there would not be a law school here if not for Mark Robinson. And Mark has been tremendously generous in supporting the law school in every possible way. Mark has provided us almost $2 million for scholarships for our students. So some of the students are here. Your legal education has been paid for by Mark Robinson. Our courtroom is named as the Mark Robinson Courtroom. Mark teaches trial advocacy for us. In fact, he taught the very first class ever in the Mark Robinson Courtroom. Mark volunteers his time in every possible way. He's the chair of our Board of Visitors of the law school. He's recently agreed to be the co-chair of our building campaign committee. He's embarking on building a new law school building here on campus. Mark is one of the leading trial lawyers in the country. He's a graduate of Stanford University and Loyola Law School. If you think of any major lawsuit, most recently the Toyota case, Mark is one of the leading counsel within it. And so we are so incredibly fortunate to have Mark as a key supporter of this school. And right at the outset, it was decided that an appropriate thing to do to honor Mark would be to create an annual Mark Robinson Lecture. And it's amazing that already we're at the 4th Mark Robinson Lecture. NYU Law Professor Bert Newborn delivered the 1st. Chief Judge of the 10th Circuit and President of Oklahoma City University, Robert Henry, delivered the 2nd. Former federal judge and Harvard Law Professor Nancy Gertner delivered the 3rd. And this year we have David Wilkins. I've gotten to introduce a lot of people here over the 5 years of the law school's existence, but no introduction has for me been more fun than this one will be, or a greater pleasure than this one will be. I know a lot of law professors refer to famous faculty at other schools as their old dear friends. I wonder sometimes that's hyperbole. In this instance, it's certainly true. I met David in the spring of 1969 when he was finishing 8th grade and I was finishing my sophomore year of high school. And he was coming to my high school the next year, and I set out to recruit David to join our high school debate team. David was a superstar high school debater, and I was lucky enough that he was my debate partner for a good deal of those next 2 years. After high school, David went on to Harvard College, to Harvard Law School, clerked for Judge Wilfred Feinberg on the United States Court of Appeals for the 2nd Circuit. He then clerked for Justice Thurgood Marshall on the United States Supreme Court. He entered private practice in Washington, D.C., and then joined the Harvard Law School faculty. He's the Lester Kissel Professor of Law at Harvard. He's been the director of the program on the legal profession there since 1991. He's the Vice Dean for Global Initiatives, and he's also one of the nicest people I've ever met in my whole life. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce you to the Mark Robinson Lecture this year, Harvard Professor David Wilkins.
Thank you. I've been introduced by many people, but I have never had an introduction that has meant quite as much to me. You know, you are in many ways formed by the things that happen to you early on in life, and people who make a difference, who decide they're going to make a difference in your life. And high school debate was an incredibly meaningful experience for me. I was somebody who, you know, I was never completely shy, but I was much more shy, and I was certainly much more uncomfortable about public speaking or about writing or about advocacy. And high school debate was an incredibly important thing in teaching me those skills. And I learned them from, we had a wonderful debate coach, which we were still very close with, both Irwin and I, but I got a chance to learn them up close from Irwin. And as Mr. Robinson, you know, because you had this dream for many years, but it was only when you got someone with those advocacy skills that it was able to make that dream a reality. And Irwin has always been unbelievably persuasive in his ability to get things done. Now, listening to that introduction, he has changed in one important way, which, although those of you from California probably thought, well, he speaks sort of fast now. Well, you should have seen the way he spoke when he was a high school debater. He could have delivered my entire 40-minute lecture in about the 10 minutes that you got in for your side in the debate. And that's, in fact, why we won so many debates, because he would just have so many more words than anyone else could possibly come up with, and they were all brilliant. So it is really a great pleasure to be here and in this lecture series with someone who really has been a visionary in the way in which you have supported legal education at a time in which, you know, the academy and the profession haven't always been on the same page, in which, you know, there have been a lot of complaints, some of which are justifiable, about the way in which the academy has understood the profession. But it really takes a visionary leader like yourself to understand that nevertheless we need each other, and the best way to bring them closer together is for a great lawyer to be a part of a great institution. And there's no better way to be a part of a great institution than to be a part of creating that institution. And then not just giving money, and Dean, I'm not I'm minimizing money. Money's very important, I get it. But, you know, there's only one thing that there's a finite amount of, and that's time. And the fact that you give your time to come and listen to these lectures, especially on Valentine's Day, the fact that you give your time to the students to teach in the classes, that you act as an advisor to Irwin, and he's told me how important your judgment has been to him on many things that he's done. That is the greatest gift of all. So thank you, and thank you for allowing me to hang out with my old high school buddy here. It's also a great pleasure to be here, because this law school, I think, is one of the most exciting things that's happened in legal education in a very long time. I mean, it's been a very long time since a law school has been created from the ground up with a visionary leader like Irwin in charge, with the resources that have allowed the law school to recruit an outstanding faculty. And I know many of the people who have been recruited here, absolutely, who are absolutely you know, at the top of their fields. And to, right from the beginning, have a dynamic and an amazing student body, you know, to really recruit terrific students. And I had the pleasure of teaching in the first year lawyering legal profession class here, where I had the whole first year class, and it was just a really incredible group of students. So this is really where the action is in many ways, and what's happening in legal education and what can happen. And because you're a new law school, you're able to do things that, you know, you would be harder to do if you were an established law school with a history and a lot of entrenched interests. So I've been watching this from afar, and so it's it's a great pleasure to be a part of it. What I want to do is talk about today, and hold on, let me see if I can make this come back on, is a question I think that's on every lawyer's mind today. Was 2008 or 2009, did that signal a brave new world, a new paradigm of law? Or was it really a kind of temporary dip, right? And we've seen the legal profession go through dips, right? It didn't for a long time, but 1991, there was a serious recession in the economy, and there was a serious recession in the legal profession. But by 1993, people didn't remember it very much anymore. 2001, there was an even bigger dip in the economy and also in the legal profession. And by 2002, nobody remembered it, right? So people have been asking this question, right? Particularly with respect to law firms. Are we witnessing, the death of big law, Is this going to be some paradigm shift where law firms look fundamentally different and legal practice is fundamentally different than it was before? Or is it really just a trough that will eventually get through as the Dow goes to 14,000 and above? Here's my answer. Who knows? If I knew the answer to that question, I'd be a very, very successful person. But the fact of the matter is, it's too early to tell. When you're in the middle of a paradigm shift, you actually don't know whether it's one or not. You have to get on the other side and look back. But the one thing I can be pretty certain of is it's unlikely to be either. That is, it's unlikely to be something in which, the law school or the legal practice that I grew up in will be unrecognizable to the students of this law school in 5 or 10 years. But I don't think it's likely to be 2007 anytime soon, right? That some important things are going on. Why? Because what we're seeing is, I think, in 2008, was just the acceleration of some large-scale trends that were already going on before the recession and got pushed along or accelerated by the recession, but are unlikely to be reversed just because the recession is reversed. And that collectively, these changes are going to reshape the entire economy and therefore the market for legal services and therefore law firms, right? Because law firms don't exist in some independent universe. They are a part of the larger legal services market and the larger economy, which is changing. And they've got to adapt. Law firms have to adapt to this new reality if they are going to succeed. So what are the big changes? You know what they are. Globalization of economic activity and the huge movement of economic activity from, north and west to south and east. We all know this is going on here in California. Maybe you know that better than most people in the world. The rise of information technology. The increasing capacity and speed and intelligence of data. My first job was in the computer room at Commonwealth Edison in Chicago. Chris Tomlins probably remembers vaguely what that was. And it used to be some giant room as big as this whole law school building, filled with big machines with tape drives spitting out gigantic pieces of perforated paper. And all of it had less computing power than the things we hold in our pockets today. And this is nothing compared to where information technology is going, right? Fundamentally changing our world. The last part is a little bit academic sounding, but I always say I'm an academic, so I get to talk this way. It's the blurring together of what you might think of as the 19th century or 18th century categories of organization and thought that we've used to think about the world. Think the legal profession and its distinction from business or politics, right? This is a relatively recent invention, right? Think the private corporation and its distinction from the public or the state. Relatively recent invention. Think the disciplines that many of the students studied in school, economics, sociology, political science. The idea that all of these things represented some very sharp-edged category that we use to distinguish things is something that we've kind of gotten used to. It's not that those categories don't make any sense at all anymore. It's just no one thinks that they're as sharply defined as they once were, right? So, if you ask the question, the legal profession, is it a profession or a business? I bet you would say, Mr. Robinson, of course it's both. It's a very noble and learned profession, but it's in a very competitive, increasingly competitive global business. Is GM a public corporation or a private corporation or a government entity after 2009 and the government bailout? Everything is about understanding the way in which the categories that we've used to think about the world are blurring together. What has that meant? It's totally reshaped our economy. The first thing is there's been a huge reduction in what the economists would call information asymmetry between buyers and sellers. To put it in simple terms, it just means buyers are way more sophisticated about what they're purchasing and therefore able to evaluate those services or goods in a way that they never were able to do before, which has, in production terms, allowed for sophisticated consumers to take things that used to come all packaged together and unbundle them and array them increasingly across what you might call global supply chains. The example, actually, when I was talking to Professor Southworth's students was music, okay? Many of you are old enough to remember when you wanted to buy music, you went to something called a record store. Remember those things, right? And you went and you could only buy the record that was in the record store, right? And you looked through the bins, you know, and then you bought this thing, which was a big giant thing like this, and it was all shrink wrapped, and so you couldn't actually open it, and it had all this beautiful cover art on it, and it had 18 or 16 songs on it, you know, and it cost whatever, $9.99. And you bought that whole thing so that you could get the one song that they were playing on the radio, right? Well, you know, just think how the students buy music, to the extent they do buy music at all. That's another subject for a copyright class, maybe. They go to iTunes, or they go to Pandora and stream it, or they borrow it from a playlist from a friend, right? And then they assemble it for themselves for their purposes, right? Just think fundamental change. And we could talk about travel agents and how you buy tickets. We could talk about, you know, how you buy books or Amazon or Craigslist, all these things, right? Allowed people to take things that used to come put together, take them apart and array them across global supply chains. That's changed the nature of competition. So it used to be you judge the quality of something primarily and sometimes almost exclusively by its inputs, like who made it, what was their experience, you know, where did you buy it, right? You had all these proxies for the quality that came from its provenance because you couldn't actually assess the value ex post, or it was hard to assess the value ex post. Now, the value is moving increasingly in the hands of sophisticated consumers to what's the value, not just objectively, but to me, measured increasingly in objective metrics. So think going on Amazon and looking at the reviews of other people and saying, you know, did people like me like this product, right? This is increasingly the way in which we judge quality, not by its inputs, but by its outputs, and those outputs are increasingly measured by sophisticated consumers in terms of data or metrics. All right? Third part. That's then changed the way in which firms operate. So we used to think of firms as, you know, little city-states, you know, hermetically sealed organizations where you were either inside or outside, right? And if you were inside, and there was a sharp boundary between the inside and the outside. Today, increasingly, and I don't have to tell people who live in California this, because you sort of invented this, we don't talk about firms very much anymore. We talk about networks. So my colleague Yochai Benkler, who's a leading expert on internet and technology, he wrote a great book, which is, you know, not easy to read, but it's worth reading if you do read it, but it's very difficult to read, so I'll just tell you the punchline, which then takes off on another great book, which is also very brilliant, but also very difficult to read, which you've heard of, right? The book you've heard of is Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. So Yochai's book's called The Wealth of Networks. And his argument is that value is created not inside the hermetically bounded walls of the company, but in companies that allow people and ideas and information and technology to move across networks, right? Think of Apple, okay? I have an iPhone, many of you have iPhones. You know, Apple, people say, well, Apple's a great American company. Well, sort of. but it has a few thousand people in Cupertino or whatever it is. But actually, everything about the iPhone is created through a kind of global network, right? Foxconn does the manufacture, Dow Corning did the glass, a legion of app designers are the people who actually produce the content. Apple is a network, a very successful network, which has allowed for ideas, information, and people to move across that network to create value. All right? These things are transforming our entire economy. Why in the world would we think lawyers or law firms would be different, right? Lawyers and law firms are integrated into the economy, not separate from it. So what does this mean for law firms? Well, the first thing is there are increasingly sophisticated clients who have access to very sophisticated information, partly from public sources of data, I'll come back to that in a second, partly from the acquisition of legal talent by bringing in-house the lawyers who used to work outside. So they have acquired sophisticated access to information, and therefore they are demanding more from their law firms, because they understand more about the way in which the law firm works, in part because the general counsel is a former partner of the law firm, or if not that law firm, some other law firm. Demanding greater transparency. They then are saying to the law firms, we don't want the equivalent of the album, that you used to give us, which was all the legal work, all bundled together, shrink wrapped so we couldn't see what was on the inside, and priced at a very high markup to pay for the cover art. Read Horses on the Wall. We want you to take that product and take it apart, and we'll figure out what parts are going to be done by the top law firms and what parts are going to be shipped to a legal process outsourcing company in India and what parts are going to be given to a regional firm and what parts might be done by a counsel in China. We want you to unbundle the product and increasingly lay it along the same kind of global supply chain and achieve billing practices that are not about inputs like how many hours did it take, what are the credentials of the lawyers who did it, but are measured in outputs in terms of what the value is to me. This in turn is creating new competitors. So it used to be when we thought about the corporate market for legal services, we talked about law firms. Then we had to talk about law firms and in-house legal departments. Now we have to talk about, I already talked about, legal process outsourcing organizations. We have to talk about multidisciplinary professional service firms that put together things at the intersection of law and competitive strategy and finance. The most obvious example of those are the big accounting firms who haven't been accounting firms for years. They have been multidisciplinary organizations which are increasingly branding themselves as globally integrated business solution firms, of which, by the way, law is a part of the business solution. More and more competitors. And many of you know there's a set of reforms in the UK that have now gone into effect, which have removed most of the barriers about the organizational form in which law can be practiced. So you can have non-lawyers owning law firms, you can have multidisciplinary law firms, you can have public investment in law firms. You've got a lot of different things that are going to create a whole new wave of competitors that are going to complicate what the market for legal services look like. And all of this is putting pressure on the historic business model, particularly of the large law firm. So I'm going to be mostly talking here about the traditional large law firm. But note that these pressures are reshaping the market in general. And maybe Mr. Robinson will tell me in the question and answer how this is affecting the kind of world and practice that he does. So, what's the new normal? What does it look like these days? The old normal was, this is how law firms made money. They made money by rate increases, which were clicking along at a 6 or 7% yearly increase for like the last 20 years. Nice work if you could get it. And they worked on leverage models, which is, hire more people at the bottom, have a bigger team, bill more hours, and raise the rates. Okay, raise the overall billing. It's not that those things are going to go away completely, but clients, increasingly sophisticated clients, have put extreme pressure on both. They're rebelling against rate increases, and they are saying things like, we don't want to have first-year associates, untrained first-year associates on our matters, okay? So there's pressure both on leverage and on rate increases. Moreover, clients are saying, you know those beautiful handcrafted vases of briefs that you used to give us, or the beautiful deals where everything was perfect and then you laminated it and put it in a cube and put it on your desk? You know, well, sometimes we might want that. If the stakes are high enough, if the uncertainty is great enough, yeah, we want, you know, a bespoke solution, a handcrafted, hand-tailored solution, like a Savile Row suit. But you know what? A lot of times, off the rack is good enough. Because for us, this is not one deal in a million. This is one deal that we do 1,000 a year or 100 a year, right? This litigation is a part of a kind of business risk that we're running for doing this kind of work. So we don't want handcrafted vases that are built from the ground up one at a time. We want business solutions. We want to integrate law into something that we can manage, and the key to managing is to understand the cost. What is the cost that this is going to charge us for the value that it's going to create for us? A very different world in the way in which sophisticated general counsels operate. All right, that's the bad news. Here's the good news. I promised the students that I was going to give them some good news. These things in some ways are squeezing the legal market, but at the same time, the demand for high-quality legal services is increasing. Why? Because the world's getting way more complicated, with different, you know, jurisdictions competing over regulatory space. You know, you have the state, local law, state law, national law, and now you've got international law, multinational organizations, WTO, GATS, doing a cross-border deal. You have to figure out, you know, the money's being raised in Tokyo for a project financing in Nigeria. You've got partners, you know, a venture capital fund in Brazil. Okay, that's multiplying complexity, and guess what? We do very well in complexity, right? The demand for lawyers goes up as things get more complicated. So the law firms of the future have to navigate this complexity. They have to think about both the pressures that are pushing towards a more commoditized view of, a more standardized, a more process-oriented view of legal services, but they also have to figure out how to help their clients live in an increasingly complex and risky world. The ones who do that are the ones who figure out how to partner with organizations in a disaggregated world in which supply chains and unbundling are taking place, to partner with their best clients, but also to provide efficiency and value. Now that's not easy, and I want to say a little bit about what people are doing to try to meet that challenge. But not everybody's made it, okay? Let's just be honest. You know, whether this is the death of big law or not, a lot of big law firms have died. So here's just a small list since the recession. Heller in 2008, Thiele in 2008, Thatcher Profit 2008, Woke Block 2009, Howery 2011. In the UK's Halliwells, which was a very large and successful firm, went under in 2010. And of course, Dewey LaBeouf. Which, you know, when I went to go give a lecture in South Africa, I said, well, what do you want to hear about? They said, Dewey LaBeouf. Okay, there you go. A global failure because it was huge, right? So let me just say a few words about why law firms fail as a way to think more about why they might succeed. So, you know, as many of you know, Dewey LaBeouf was the project of one of these blockbuster mergers, and we're seeing these kind of mergers all the time, right? 2007, between a very old established firm, you know, Dewey is, after all, Thomas E. Dewey, the former governor of New York, and LaBeouf Land, very successful firm, came together and they said, we're going to be the new global powerhouse. They came together in 2007, right? But, you know, if you're going to be a global powerhouse, you need a lot of global powerhouse lawyers. So they went on a buying spree of star lawyers. recruiting them from other law firms, and because they were doing well in their other law firms, they had to pay them what star sports teams pay, all right? I don't know what you're feeling about Dwight Howard these days, okay? Right? Think Dwight Howard, think, well, you know, and some of them turned out good, and some of them turned out like Dwight Howard. But, you know, you have to give them big guarantees. But once you start giving guarantees, now you're creating big differentials in the partnership between people who have the guarantees and people who don't. So therefore, you try to keep it secret. You try not to tell people. But how easy is it to keep things secret inside a law firm, particularly when it's about compensation? Particularly when your big model for the future runs up against the biggest recession since the Great One, right? Their revenues dropped, you know, by 20%, okay, in 1 year. What did they do? They went out and got a big loan, $125 million bond offering. And people started to leave because people started to say, I know who's on the hook for this. If this doesn't work, economy is crashing. This is now 2010. 2011, they are forced to disclose that almost 1/3 of all the partners are on some kind of guarantee because they started paying retention bonuses, not just signing bonuses or signing guarantees. Which of course then meant for the 2/3 who didn't have them, they said, what am I doing here supporting these people? And so people started leaving, right? And what you get in a law firm is called unraveling. You know, it's just people start leaving and then people say, oh, I better leave too. Nobody wants to be the last one turning out the lights or on the hook for the $125 billion, right? By 2012, 200 partners had left, you know, and the rest is history. So what can we learn from this, right? I often think you can learn as much from failure as from success, right? There's a lot of global mergers going on. Here's a question. Are they synergy or are they desperation? Right? I think what happened in Dewey LaBeouf was that Dewey had thought for 100 years it was just like Cravath. And then it woke up and it realized it was not just like Cravath. And that their partners per profit were different than Cravath, their client base was different from the Cravath, and they got scared. And they went looking for somebody, they said, we got to get bigger, we got to bulk up, right? And a lot of mergers, those of you who study corporate law and corporate mergers, most mergers end up losing value for exactly this reason. All those synergies don't turn out to happen, but a lot of costs do. Second, what about firms that grow really fast in a really short period of time? So Dewey was ramping up by bringing in all these lateral partners. How do you keep culture in a world in which you are bringing in lots of people who are coming in for basically only one reason? Because you're paying them a lot more than other people were paying them. We actually have a whole project on the movement of star lawyers, and it turns out, not surprisingly, stars, if you hire a star from one place by paying them a lot of money, guess what tends to happen a few years later? Yeah, somebody pays them more money. Right? I mean, they've shown that they're willing to move for the money, and people know that, right? Oftentimes they're not as productive, see Dwight Howard, you know, than they used to be in their old place because you hire them at the top of the market, right? The people who get rid of them, why did Orlando ultimately decide it was okay to get rid of them? Because they know more about him than you do, right? They have more inside information. You could just go down the list, right? This turns out to be a strategy that many law firms are using, and it's a highly risky one. I'm not saying it can never work, but it's a highly risky strategy, right? What about capital structure, right? So they went out, when things got tough, they went out and got this $125 million loan. Now, you know, when these UK legal reforms came in, people said, oh, who needs capital? Law firms don't need capital. They can raise capital from their partners. I say to my students all the time, here's a hint. Anyone who says to you who's in a competitive business, who needs capital, you should be looking to change jobs. Okay, everybody needs capital, right? And the cheaper the capital, the better. And one of the most expensive and dangerous sources of capital is big bank loans that come with lots of conditions, like how much your revenue has to be, and if too many partners leave, they can call the loans. And so what happened to many, Howery in particular, is Citibank called the loan. And when they called the loan, that was it. Close the doors. Okay? So how does capital structure relate to the success of law firms? And finally, governance structure. You know, Dewey had a it turned out he was the LaBeouf Lamb partner. I actually know him pretty well. There's a category of kind of strong visionary leaders who have come to run a lot of big law firms today. Visionary leadership can be fantastic, but so long as the vision works, right? But sometimes it can be very dangerous when the vision either gets out of step with reality or the visionary leader dies. Testa Hurwitz was a very, very successful tech firm in Boston. It was doing fantastically well until Dick Testa suddenly and unexpectedly dropped dead of a heart attack. 2 years later, the firm was gone. What's the succession plan? What's the role for dissent? Has everybody who dissented with the strategy been driven out of the firm? Okay? So I just say these to say you can learn a lot from thinking about failure, and I think if we think about the future of law firms, these are all very important issues on the table. Okay, if that weren't complicated enough, the world's getting even more complicated. Here's a question that we thought we knew the answer to very easily. Where beats the heart of the global economy? Okay, easy, 25 blocks between downtown Manhattan and Midtown. Okay, sorry for Californians. Maybe there's an outpost in Silicon Valley in LA, but you know, we knew where the heart of the global economy beat. You know, even before the crisis, there was a pretty good argument that much of it was moving east to London. If you looked at the number of IPOs, if you looked at a lot of the big deals, and you could look at the size of the law firms, right? Where were the biggest law firms? They were the UK Magic Circle firms. Well, we all know it's moving way farther east and farther south. And I use these statistics in every lecture I give because I don't think Americans have fully understood this, right? So the IMF did this series of projections of where world GDP is in 2010 and said, where's it going to be in 2050, okay? So, won't surprise you that the West, the UK, the US, North America, accounted for 41% of all the world's GDP in 2010. Now, if I were teaching this class, I would ask you, what do you predict the IMF says this will be in 2050? But I'm not teaching the class, so I tell you, all right, there, I have a real pessimist over here. So you get a range, right? The optimists say, well, it's going to go down, but, you know, there's a lot of instability in the developing world, and, you know, we're America, and we know how to come back, and we're the land of ingenuity, and, you know, so it's going to go to maybe 35%. And the pessimists say, are you insane? You know, China's going to be the world's largest economy, Asia rising, you know, look at what's happening in Europe, all this instability is actually in the West, not the East. It's going to be really bad, it's going to go down like to 25%. You know what the IMF says? 18%. You were close. You know, just let that sink in for a moment. 18%, okay? That's more than a 50% decline. Where's it going to go? Asia's going to flip places with the West, 27% to 49%. But here's my favorite part, and this is what we were just talking. You have one of my spectacular former students on your faculty who's going to start, as I understand, an Africa Law Institute. I think there could be nothing more important today, if you believe these statistics, that Africa, the Middle East, and North Africa is going to go from 8% to 21%. In fact, sub-Saharan Africa is going to go from 2% to 12%, making it the fastest growing region in the world. And if you're reading my slides correctly, it could be that in 2050, Africa, North Africa, and the Middle East could account for more of the world's GDP than everything we think of as the developed world today. If that doesn't float your boat, I'm not sure what will. And by the way, they're not just going to be keeping the money there, they're going shopping, okay? They're taking the trillions of dollars of our money that they've accumulated over the years, and they're going out and acquiring things all over the world, including here. Lawyers follow the money. This is going to reshape the market for legal services. All right. I'm going to throw a little data at you. I'm going to kind of do it fast because I don't want to bore you too much, but you know, I'm a data guy, so I think you might find this interesting, right? I run something called a corporate purchasing project where we looked at the S&P 500 companies and we asked them how do they purchase legal services in important matters, right? And we started with focus groups and case studies. We then did interviews of general counsels, and 60% of the general counsels in investment banks. Remember we used to have these things called investment banks before? Yeah, there are no investment banks anymore, actually. Commercial banks, petroleum and pharmaceuticals, and it accounted for a big chunk of the S&P 500 and a particularly big chunk of the big users of legal services. We also then followed this up with a survey, and I run a project now called Globalization, Lawyers and Emerging Economies, or GLEE, as we like to call it, after the popular TV show, in which we have over 50 researchers on the ground looking in places like India, China, and Brazil, hopefully in Africa one day soon, about how the legal services market is changing in those places. Okay, and I also teach executive education courses called Leadership in Law Firms. I've taught over something like 300 partners, managing partners, heads of practice areas of top law firms around the world, as well as a bunch of general counsels. Okay, so in the qualitative interviews, we asked, what do you look for when you're hiring lawyers, right? And we asked a bunch of questions around this, right? And as I said, in important matters. Not, you know, bet the company matters. I often think actually that's one of the stupidest phrases ever invented, because if you're betting the company, say, more than once, you should be fired, okay? You should not be betting the company, okay? But, you know, there's important work, and then there's work we know is all driven by price. So we were looking at, you know, the kind of work that large law firms want to do. And we took all those interviews I told you about, and we dumped them in a word processing program called Wordle. You know what Wordle is? It's one of these wonderful things where it'll just take text and it'll graphically show you what words were said more as a kind of indication of what people are talking about more. It's very approximate, but I think it's fun, okay? Oh, sorry, this is the Wordle thing. Sorry. All right, let me go through this. Here we go. Where's the Wordle? All right, no, I'm going to go through this. Sorry, because otherwise we'll never get to it. Here it is. Okay. What's the biggest word on this slide? Relationships. Okay. Here I'm going to come over. Sorry, you want to? I can't do this for anybody else to see. Yeah, I don't think there's anybody in the other room, by the way. Look how big that is, right? Relationships are the biggest word here. If I had a mouse on here, I could do this. It's still a relationship business. Okay. They care what you know. See that word? They care how hard you work. Yes. But it's a relationship business. Actually, I have to do this one more time. Okay. You see this tiny little word right up here? Anybody can read that for me? What's it say? Smart. Okay? Remember, the bigger the word, the more it's said. The smaller the word, okay? How do lawyers think that clients purchase services? Because how smart I am. I'm so smart. I was ordering the coif. I was a genius. I clerked on the Supreme Court. Now, I say, it's not that they want you to be dumb, but they sort of take for granted that you're smart enough. And now it's a question of whether we build a good relationship together. All right? Let me just I'll throw a few more pieces of data at you, see if it grabs you here. So we asked them, now this is on the survey. We asked, look at the factors. We gave them a bunch of factors to rate, you know, from unimportant to very important. And how are you assessing the quality of the legal services that you're getting, where price is relevant but not the dominant characteristic, okay? This is what the table looked like. You see the first three things on there? I wonder if I could make a mouse come out here. Is there a mouse down here? I wonder if this works. Yeah, oh, whoa! What happened? What happened? I don't know. Okay. I tell you what, let's go back. No? Okay, I don't know what happened. All right, not using the mouse, sorry. John, no creativity here. Results in similar cases, prior reputation and prior relationship dominate everything else, okay? Nothing else crosses the important line, including, you know, do we have 5,000 lawyers or 200 lawyers? You know, do we have an office in Tajikistan? That's market reach. You know, commitment to diversity, quality control. These are all kind of somewhat important, dominated by relationship-specific factors, okay? All right, hold that thought. I promise this will come together. We then asked, how do people get the information to make these judgments? That is, how do you decide what is, what's the reputation of a firm? Or, what is its quality control system? It turns out, see the first bar there? They asked the most important person they know. This is general counsels filling out this survey. Who's the most important person? Me, myself, and I, okay? And I think I understand the legal services market very well, and that's who I consult. In fact, the funniest part here, can you just see, it's not actually 100%. This is like 97%. So 3% of all general counsels are kind of like Hamlet. They don't actually trust themselves. Then the next most important source of information is other people in my organization. So I ask other people in the legal department, other business people, okay? Nothing surprising here. Here's what got surprising for me. Only half of the general counsels we surveyed talked to anyone else outside of their organization, okay? And all those rankings, Chambers and Company, big deals, best looking male transactional lawyer of 2012. They don't look at those very much, right? Even though law firms obsess completely about those rankings, right? Get the idea here, it's a relationship-driven business and it's an internally focused problem. Process, I should say. But we have a big sample. So we can actually compare the people who looked only internally. That's the people in the first two, the left-hand columns. Those are your left-hand columns, right? With the people who also looked externally. Nobody only looked externally, but lots of companies actually consulted other people or looked at rankings in making hiring decisions. So we wanted to know, were they any different than the ones who only looked internally? Answer, they were different. They weren't different on the core factors. So actually what it says, results in similar cases, that's the same, that's those three factors compressed, right? Results in similar cases, reputation, and prior relationship. But look at what happens to commitment to diversity, quality control, and ethical infrastructure. The green line are people who also looked both internally and externally, and the orange line is only internally. All of a sudden, these things become much more important. These differences are all statistically significant at a very high level of significance. Get the idea? When you start looking externally and asking people, you actually begin to value different kinds of things than if you're only hiring the same law firm or the same group of people that you did before. And that things like diversity and ethical infrastructure just means how much do they check up on what they're doing, how much do they, how much are associates checked out by the partners, is there cross-checking of opinion letters, things like that. And the quality control systems, again, are related to how do we assure that it's a quality product. Suddenly you start worrying about those things more. What do I think this means? I think we've got a new breed of general counsel who are coming. And these general counsels are much more numerate, meaning they're much more able to look at data and assess the value of data than used to be the case for people who became general counsels. And it's in part because the companies in which they work are driving them to be much more numerate and metric driven, because that's how everyone else in the organization is being measured. Used to be that, okay, it's a tough year, everybody's taking a 20% haircut in all the departments, but the general counsel will say, yeah, but not us. Why not? Because law is different, and you can't assess what we do and you can't hold it accountable to metrics. The new world, I said in the beginning, that argument is no longer a persuasive argument. That means these general counsels are trying to develop a new logic with firms. They want their firms to be their partners, not just their agents, right? These are companies that have explicitly said this, Goldman Sachs, Dole share. They want you to share risks as well as benefits, and they want to trust you, but like we used to say in the old nuclear deterrent days, trust but verify, right? We want to trust that you're doing a good job for us, but we actually want to see data that supports it. I think this has been a lot of big changes for law firms going forward, right? May you live in interesting times, right? Here's the good news. The legal market's coming back. I don't think there's any question about that, right? With the Dow at 14,000, people are hiring again. It's certainly not 2007, but the market is coming back. And as I said, global complexity is going to drive more demand for legal services. But there are going to be big continuing challenges, right? Corporate legal budgets are tight. There's increasing competition for global work, in part because countries around the world are developing large and sophisticated law firms, and that we're going to see much more consolidation, and some of it will either bypass the US or will happen so much outside of the United States that we will not always be the center of the law firm world. My favorite example here is King & Wood, which some of you know is a very large Chinese law firm. It has 1,000 lawyers. It doesn't have a Mr. King or it doesn't have a Mr. Wood, but it has 1,000 Chinese lawyers. And they just merged or purchased, depending upon your point of view, the largest and most important law firm in Australia called Mallison Stevens & Jenks. And they're reputed to be looking at law firms in the United States and in the UK and in South Africa, which means in 2014 or 15, King & Wood could be the largest law firm in the world, based in Beijing, China. Big change, right? This means that law firms are getting squeezed in at least 3 ways, right? They're being squeezed vertically by increasingly sophisticated clients demanding more for less. They're squeezed horizontally by new competitors. So no matter how big you are, there's a firm that's bigger telling your clients you're not big enough, right? And then if you're really big, then everybody says, but you're fat and inefficient. So now you have a whole bunch of people coming along like legal processing outsourcing companies in India trying to hollow out your work. They may not be able to take the top end work, but law firms make a lot of money from staffing the work from top to bottom, revolutionizing the business model. And finally, they're being squeezed by your students, Irwin. You know, I was talking to a leading corporate lawyer in India, and she said, you know, we had the war for talent, and talent won. Meaning, talent is the coin of the realm, right? And increasingly, there's a huge competition for that talent, right? Now, it's a variegated market, so they don't want everybody in every law school, but the people they want at the top law schools, the competition for that talent is going up, not down. Okay, so this is all very interesting from inside baseball. And actually, one of Professor Southworth's students asked this really great question in which she said, yeah, but what does this all mean for law as a profession? And that's a deep question, I think, right? Because law doesn't just belong to lawyers and the legal profession. It belongs to, you know, the people we serve and the societies in which we live, right? It's always been fundamentally close to sovereignty and legitimacy of a political system. You know, and lawyers have played a key role in organizing the modern state. You know, through the rule of law, access to justice, you know, and lawyers as leaders. You know, in government, in business, in community. The lawyers have played a very important role in our society and a pretty important role in many societies around the world, right? And law firms have been a big source of this leadership, right? You know, Dean Acheson, you know, look at the people who've come out of our current Attorney General, Eric Holder, you know, came out of Covington and Burling most recently. Law firms have been an important source of leadership. What do all these changes have to say about the role of lawyers as leaders in society, right? I think this is a challenge. And I said to your students today that I call this the paradox of professional distinctiveness, which I expect to be on sweatshirts and t-shirts and coffee mugs all over the world. You know, I expect to make a lot of money on this, so cite me for this, or at least to become famous. What is that? Well, as the legal profession has to respond to the changes in the global economy, it's forcing them to become more like businesses, right? They have to, because it's a globally competitive market. And if you don't understand yourself as a competitive business, you are in risk of being roadkill, you know? And there are plenty of law firms who have found this out, right? But the more law firms look just like their clients, people ask the question, so why should law be different? Why should you have to go to 3 years of law school and get a bar membership, right? Why should, go to 2 years of business school? Just join the hedge fund outright. Why should lawyers have special status in courts and other agencies, right? If it's just a business, then why should it be special, right? And there's a big problem here, because norms like craft, public service, commitment to the rule of law have been essential to the ideal of being a lawyer. If you ask how many of you went to law school to get rich, if you did, you probably made a bad choice. I mean, you might have ultimately become rich, but that isn't actually what attracts people to go to law school. They go to law school because they want to be a part of a public profession, they want to serve clients, they want to be connected to bigger public issues, okay? So there's a problem here if that stuff goes away, right? If we lose that, we might not get the kind of top people like an Irvine School to come to law school, right? We might not be able to get them to stay in law school or stay in the profession, and we might threaten the kind of autonomy of the profession. Okay, so I have a colleague who actually sadly left and went to Stanford, named George Triantis, a brilliant guy, some of you may know him. I was giving this lecture about this, and he said, well, who knows whether our profession can capture those things. Maybe that was just a blip in history, and it's no idle threat. If you look at architects and engineers, they have mostly become reabsorbed into corporate hierarchies, okay? It's not that they're not professionals in some sense, but in the sense of independence and autonomy, answer mostly no. And the forces that produce that are the same forces that are challenging us. Skyrocketing costs, internal expertise developed inside their clients, disaggregation and unbundling of services, alternative providers. All of these things, if you read the history of architects and engineers, happened in those professions too. Technology, CAD/CAM, and contributed to their at least severely being constrained as independent professions. So the question is, will this happen to us, particularly as both not just the market, but the state becomes more powerful in our world? So those UK legal reforms, they didn't come from the bar. They came from a government commission set up to reduce the cost of legal services and make British legal services more competitive in the world economy. And basically they were jammed down the throat of the profession, where they lost. Basically the regulator of the legal profession in Britain is a guy who's named Chris Kenny, who's not even a lawyer. He's a competition policy expert. So you've got the state and the market both squeezing together. Okay. Now, I can't leave you with pessimism, so here are 5 reasons why I think it's not the end of lawyers, okay? And that's especially for the students who are like, Irwin's looking at me, I invited the guy here, now they get my tuition refund. Okay. First, we've been at this for a long time, okay? Oh, you're here, the person who asked the brilliant question. What's your name? She's fantastic, okay? I promised you, and I told her she had to come to the lecture, and here she is. Brian Garth, who's now on this faculty, has written a series of books with Yves Desilets, and they call lawyers double agents. And they are sort of double agents, right? Because they both serve their clients, but they also serve their own interests. They stand at the intersection of the state and the market, of the globalized and the localized. And we're very good at it, and we've been doing it for hundreds and hundreds of years, okay? So getting rid of us will not be easy, okay? We will not go gently into that good night. The second thing is, it's crucial to recruitment, like I just said. Law students come because this is what they want. It's not all of what they want. They want successful careers, they want jobs, and we have a right, they have a right to want these things. But a lot of people choose the profession for this reason, and therefore will fight to preserve this as a part of its mission. And this is particularly true with respect to women. So one of your other terrific students was asking me about diversity and what difference will women make. We know from surveying women that they're more likely to say these are the reasons that they came to law school than being, prestigious or making money or the kinds of other sorts of reasons. And women are now more than 50% of the entry pool in not just in the United States, but around the world. In fact, in some places, it's more like 60 or 70%. Law is becoming an increasingly feminized profession. And finally, here's the key thing, clients want it. Now, they might not always think they want it, but in fact, clients need the legitimacy of lawyers who are legitimate. Because when you get in trouble, you want to be able to put your lawyer out there and have people think that your lawyer isn't just your public relations person. If they think your lawyer is just your public relations person, they won't listen to them any more than they listen to your public relations person. And having somebody who can credibly take your interest, but who can say that I am also a credible gatekeeper of something called the rule of law, is a critical part. Now, lawyers can destroy this, right? I mean, we can destroy it by being mouthpieces simply in the simple sense of the word. But I think sophisticated clients increasingly realize that there's value here, and that provides space for us, right? And if the clients don't recognize it, the law recognizes it, right? So, we've got law out there that requires your lawyer to sign off on, your securities filings or your FCPA compliance or lots of other things that gives the lawyers an incentive to act in this public gatekeeping role. And that kind of regulation is increasing, not decreasing, because it's a cheaper way to enforce compliance than hiring more cops on the street, roughly speaking. And it's not just here in the United States, but this is a model that's spreading around the world. Finally, I think globalization increases linkages among professionals to help professionals reinforce a kind of public model of the law. Now, it doesn't always work this way, but the fact that Chinese lawyers and Brazilian lawyers and Nigerian lawyers want to go to the International Bar Association, where there's a rule of law project, where they have pro bono projects, where they want to be connected to some public ideal of lawyering, this is diffusing in some ways a public ideal of lawyering. Not perfect, and by the way, some of it is coming back in the other direction. We in the US should never think that we have a monopoly on understanding law as a public profession, and we have a lot to learn from, I think, things that if people are interested in, I could talk about that are happening around the world. Okay, last point. What about us, okay? What about legal education? What does this mean for how we should be preparing our students? So whether or not the whole world is changing, it's clear legal education is changing. And there's a lot of pressure on it to be changed, right? To become much more multidisciplinary. And again, this is partly why I love being on this campus, because this is one of the things that this campus is very famous for, is a much more, not just interdisciplinary, but multidisciplinary, simultaneous, not just you spend a year here and a year there, but integrating the way in which we think about knowledge, making it interactive, forward-facing, not backward-facing. Innovation in law is hard, I like to say, because law is the only profession in the world in which you can't say something new unless you prove absolutely that someone already said it before. It makes innovation difficult, right? I think there's a much more move towards empirical work. Because, the world's complicated, and we need to understand that complication, and we need to understand what that means for how we have to train our students, right? The clients are demanding of the lawyers that they be more numerate. I think the law students should demand of the professors that they be more empirically grounded. And if all that sounds like a shameless plug for the kind of work I do, it is. Thank you very much. I appreciate your attention.